Welcome to my channel. Today we delve into a chilling tale that began high above the clouds, where calm blue skies turned into a nightmare of chaos, fear, and human defiance. This is the story of the DC-10 flight that exploded at cruising altitude, tearing the sky open in an instant and forcing its crew and passengers to confront death head-on. It was supposed to be an ordinary flight, a simple journey across calm air and clear weather, but hidden within the metal skin of that aircraft was a silent flaw, something waiting, unseen, for the perfect moment to reveal itself. As passengers buckled in, flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisles, smiling, serving coffee, tucking blankets, and the pilots in the cockpit relaxed into routine chatter. The DC-10 glided effortlessly, a masterpiece of human engineering, unaware that its next few minutes would test the very limits of survival. At 30,000 feet, the world outside was quiet. Clouds drifted lazily below, the sun glinted off the ocean far beneath, and inside the cabin, laughter and comfort filled the air. But somewhere deep within the aircraft's structure, a small imperfection, a weakness in the cargo door mechanism, was growing deadly. It wasn't visible. It wasn't loud. But it was there, a ticking time bomb hidden behind polished metal and confidence. The pilots couldn't hear it. The passengers couldn't feel it. Yet, in that moment, the flight's fate was already written. Then it happened. A sound unlike anything the human ear was meant to hear. A violent, deafening crack followed by an explosion of air that ripped through the fuselage like a blade. 1 second peace. The next, pure chaos. The cabin floor buckled, seats tore free, and oxygen masks snapped down as passengers screamed, clutching at anything to stay grounded. The roar of the decompression was so loud it drowned out every other sound, turning cries into whispers against the wind's fury. In the cockpit, alarms erupted. Red lights blinked violently across the control panels as the aircraft pitched downward. The captain's hands flew to the yoke, his instincts taking over even before thought could catch up. "We've lost pressure. Cabin decompression. Check doors," he shouted, his voice trembling with both command and fear. The co-pilot's eyes darted across the instruments, disbelief in every breath. "We've lost part of the cargo door." The realization hit like a second explosion. The cargo door, the very barrier between the pressurized cabin and the vacuum of the sky, had blown out, tearing a gaping hole in the fuselage. The sudden decompression had ripped through the cabin floor, sucking seats, luggage, and passengers into the abyss. The cockpit crew fought against the plunge, their bodies straining against gravity, hearts pounding with every second that ticked closer to disaster. Inside the cabin, chaos had a face, fear, smoke, and silence fighting for control. Passengers gasped for breath as the thin air clawed at their lungs. Flight attendants, though terrified, moved with desperate courage. One pulled a child into her lap and wrapped her arms around him, shielding him from flying debris as the cabin rattled violently. Another crawled down the aisle through the smoke, trying to calm an elderly man whose oxygen mask had torn away. "Hold on," she shouted, though her voice was swallowed by the roar of rushing air. The DC-10 was plummeting, and outside, the sky had turned into a blur of blue and white. The pilots leveled the wings with sheer will, muscles screaming, voices trembling. "We're losing hydraulics," the co-pilot said, barely able to hear his own words. "No, not yet," the captain replied, his eyes narrowing. "We're still flying. We're not done." The control tower's radar picked up the distress call moments later. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Flight 981. We've had an explosive decompression, descending immediately." The voice came through distorted, broken by static, but the fear was unmistakable. On the ground, controllers scrambled, rerouting all air traffic, clearing emergency lanes, and calling every available rescue unit to prepare for a possible crash. "Flight 981, what is your situation?" one of them asked, voice cracking through the radio. There was no reply for a long moment, just silence. Then finally, the captain's calm but heavy tone. We've lost part of the aircraft, multiple injuries on board. Attempting emergency landing. That one line, spoken with impossible steadiness, froze everyone listening. Inside the cockpit, sweat dripped down the captain's forehead as he fought to stabilize the descent. The airspeed fluctuated wildly, the altimeter spinning like a compass gone mad. Below them, the ocean shimmered with deceptive calm, waiting. "We need to level at 10,000, the co-pilot urged. "Get them air." The captain nodded, his hands trembling but sure. 10,000. We can do this. Every second was a war between life and physics. The decompression had crippled their systems, and the controls were sluggish, unresponsive. Yet somehow, inch by inch, they pulled the aircraft back under control. The roaring wind faded to a howl, then to a strained whistle. For a moment they dared to believe they might actually make it. But the damage was worse than anyone could have imagined. The cargo door had torn a section of the fuselage away, severing hydraulic lines that controlled the tail. Without them, landing would be almost impossible. The captain knew it, but he didn't say it. He couldn't. Behind him, hundreds of lives waited for his calm, his confidence, his humanity. So he lied with courage. "We're going to be all right," he said softly into the intercom. "Brace positions when I tell you. We're making an emergency landing." In the cabin, the passengers clung to one another. A mother held her daughter close. A businessman prayed quietly. And amid the fear, there was something else, an unspoken unity, a shared understanding that whatever happened next, they would face it together. The airport came into view like a miracle through the haze. Fire trucks lined the runway, their lights flashing red against the pale morning sky. The pilots prepared for what could be their final descent. "Flaps," the captain said. "As much as we've got." "Roger that," the co-pilot replied, his hands moving quickly across the switches. The aircraft trembled, groaned, and began to lower. The runway lights reflected in the captain's eyes as he whispered, "Come on, old girl. Just one more mile." Then, the wheels touched down. The impact was brutal. The nose slammed down, the left wing clipped the ground, and sparks erupted as the landing gear gave way. The DC-10 screeched across the runway, leaving a trail of flame and smoke behind. Inside, passengers screamed, prayed, and braced as the world turned into fire. And then, silence. When rescue teams reached the aircraft, they found a scene of devastation, but also of miracles. The cockpit crew was alive. Many passengers, bruised and bleeding, had survived. The aircraft was broken, but not destroyed. In the days that followed, investigators discovered the truth, that a design flaw in the cargo door had allowed it to blow outward under pressure, a small mechanical oversight that had nearly claimed hundreds of lives. But what saved them was not luck. It was human will. The captain's control, the crew's bravery, and the passengers' resilience turned certain death into a story of survival that would change aviation forever. And so, the tale of the DC-10 that exploded at cruising altitude became a symbol of courage in the face of catastrophe. It reminded the world that even when machines fail, the human spirit does not. Thank you for watching and listening to this story of fear, endurance, and triumph. If this story moved you, if it reminded you how fragile yet powerful life can be, I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to the channel for more real stories of courage in the skies, because every flight has a story, and some stories are written in fire, but remembered in strength. The explosion tore through the aircraft like thunder unleashed in a metal tomb, splitting peace into chaos in the blink of an eye. One moment, the DC-10 was gliding effortlessly above the clouds. The next, the cabin was transformed into a screaming vortex of wind, debris, and terror. A violent roar filled every corner as the cabin floor buckled upward, oxygen masks snapped free from their housings, and the temperature dropped to freezing in seconds. Passengers gasped, their voices ripped away by the hurricane of air rushing through the new wound in the fuselage. Anything not bolted down was gone. Coats, trays, papers, screens, all sucked into the void. The sky had entered the aircraft. The pressure change was so violent that eardrums burst and lungs burned, and the sound, the endless, monstrous sound, drowned out all reason. Some passengers blacked out instantly, the thin air robbing them of consciousness. Others clutched at their seats or each other, their minds struggling to grasp what had just happened. The world was suddenly cold, thin, and merciless. In the cockpit, the shock wave hit like a punch to the chest. The captain and co-pilot were thrown forward, their headsets ripped halfway off by the sudden rush of air. Warning alarms began screaming, bright red lights flashing across the control panels. The master caution light glowed like a wound, and the altimeter spun downward as the aircraft began an uncontrolled descent. "We've lost pressure," the co-pilot shouted, his voice hoarse from the deafening wind that forced its way through the cockpit door. The captain's instincts took over before fear could. He pushed the control column forward, forcing the nose down into an emergency dive to reach breathable altitude. Every movement of the yoke was heavy, delayed, as if the plane itself was fighting back. "Oxygen masks on," the captain barked, voice trembling but steady enough to cut through the chaos. They each reached for their masks, the rubber cold against their faces, breathing in short bursts of hissed air that tasted of metal and plastic. Behind the cockpit, the cabin crew was fighting a war of their own. The flight attendants, trained for emergencies but never for something like this, crawled through the aisles on hands and knees. The floor tilted sharply, luggage tumbling like projectiles, yet they moved anyway, checking on passengers, pulling oxygen masks over the faces of those too shocked to react. One attendant tried to reach the intercom, but the power flickered in and out, the speakers cutting to static. She grabbed the arm of a man who was bleeding from the scalp and shouted above the roar, "Hold on! Stay down!" Her voice barely carried. The air itself had become an enemy. At the back of the plane, the torn fuselage exposed the night sky, black and endless. Through that gaping hole, stars flashed like indifferent eyes watching human chaos unfold. The sight was so surreal that one surviving passenger would later say it was like seeing heaven open and hell reach back. The captain fought to regain control. The DC-10 was descending too fast, the airspeed rising toward a critical point. He wrestled the yoke, his muscles screaming with effort, trying to keep the wings level. "We've lost hydraulics on the tail," the co-pilot yelled. "She's not responding." The captain slammed his hand against the throttle, pulling it back slightly to ease the descent. "Then we'll fly her by brute force," he growled. The sweat on his forehead mixed with the cold air rushing through the vent. They were dropping through 25,000 feet, the sky outside bright and merciless, and every second felt like borrowed time. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Flight 981, explosive decompression, descending immediately." He transmitted through the emergency frequency. The tower's response was instant but broken by static. "Flight 981, say again, your transmission's unreadable." He tried again, shouting over the alarms. "We've lost the cargo door, massive structural failure." Inside the cabin, the descent was brutal. The sudden drop forced gravity to shift, pressing everyone hard against their seatbelt. Those who weren't strapped in were thrown forward, slamming into seats and walls. A child screamed, his voice muffled by the roar, as his mother covered his head with her arms. The air grew colder, the wind sharper, slicing through the cabin like knives. One of the attendants made it to the galley, hands trembling as she grabbed an oxygen bottle, using it to revive a fainted passenger. Around her, the world seemed to dissolve into fragments, bodies, smoke, tears, and metal groaning under impossible strain. She could barely stand, but she refused to give in. Crawling back toward her crew, she shouted, "We're still flying! We're still flying!" Whether it was for them or herself, no one could tell, but the words gave the others something to hold on to. In the control tower miles below, the radar screen flickered. Controllers exchanged anxious glances as one blip descended faster than any should. "They're dropping fast," one whispered. "Too fast." Calls went out to emergency units on standby. fire crews were ordered to prepare for the worst. On the radio, the captain's voice finally broke through, ragged, distorted, but alive. "We've had an explosion on board. We're descending for emergency landing." The controller replied quickly, "Roger, Flight 981, runway 24 clear. You are priority." The silence after was unbearable, every eye in the control room locked on that single fading blip. Back in the cockpit, the captain and co-pilot were beginning to win their battle. The descent slowed, the instruments stabilized slightly, and the altitude needle began to level out. 10,000 feet, the co-pilot gasped, looking up. Cabin pressure equalizing. The captain nodded, his voice calm again though his hands still trembled. "Good. Keep her steady." But they both knew they weren't safe yet. The structural damage could tear the plane apart at any moment. The tail control was sluggish, barely responding. Fuel was leaking somewhere near the wing root, and a single spark could ignite it all. Still, they pressed on. "Get me a heading to the nearest field," the captain said. The co-pilot punched at the navigation system, his fingers shaking. "We can make Cebu. It's close, maybe 30 minutes. The captain looked through the windshield at the endless sky and exhaled. "Then Cebu it is." In the cabin, calm was beginning to replace panic, but only barely. The air was thin, the smell of burning insulation thick. Flight attendants checked on each passenger, their faces pale but determined. One elderly woman clutched a rosary, whispering prayers between sobs. A businessman handed his oxygen mask to a child beside him, smiling weakly as if that simple act could erase the fear. And in that moment, amid destruction, there was humanity, the quiet, wordless strength that surfaces only when everything else is gone. The attendants, moving through the wreckage, felt it too. Fear had become a background noise. Duty had taken its place. The captain came over the intercom, his voice rough but steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've experienced a serious emergency. We're descending to a safe altitude and preparing for an emergency landing. Please stay seated, keep your belts fastened, and listen to the crew's instructions." His words carried calm, control, and something more, hope. Even those who couldn't understand the technical terms understood his tone. They had a chance. The flight attendants nodded to each other. "That's our cue," one whispered. They began securing the cabin, locking carts, clearing aisles, and checking every belt. Every movement felt like a ritual of defiance against fate. Outside, the DC-10 cut through the clouds like a wounded bird. The hole in its side gaped wide, wind howling through it as sunlight poured over the torn metal. The plane had no right to still be flying, yet it was. The engines groaned but held, the wings flexed but stayed firm. In the cockpit, the captain glanced at his co-pilot and said quietly, "We're not done yet. Not while they're still breathing." The co-pilot nodded, eyes glistening, and replied, "Then let's get them home." And as they flew onward, battered and broken but unyielding, the DC-10 became more than a machine. It became a symbol of human endurance, of will against impossibility, of a promise made silently between sky and soul: "We will not fall." The sky stretched endlessly ahead, pale and calm, but inside the DC-10, the aftermath of the explosion still haunted every breath. The air reeked of burned metal, the faint scent of smoke and fear lingering in every corner. The noise had softened, but the silence that replaced it was worse. It was a silence filled with disbelief, the kind that follows catastrophe. Every creak of the aircraft's wounded frame made hearts skip beats. Every vibration through the floor reminded everyone how close they were to the edge of survival. The passengers sat motionless, faces pale beneath flickering cabin lights. Blankets fluttered in the lingering draft from the decompression hole, and frost edged along the windows where the temperature had plummeted. Some whispered prayers, others clung to loved ones, while many stared forward in stunned quiet, their minds trapped between panic and denial. The flight attendants, moving with trembling determination, worked through the devastation. Their uniforms were torn, their hands raw from gripping the seats during the chaos, but their eyes never lost focus. One young attendant, her voice hoarse from shouting against the noise, moved row by row, touching shoulders and whispering reassurance. "We're still flying. You're all right. Help is coming." Her words sounded calm, but her heart hammered so loudly she thought it might echo through the cabin. Another attendant at the rear struggled to close a panel that kept swinging open in the turbulence. She could see daylight flickering through the torn fuselage and hear the wind shrieking outside. For a moment she froze, staring out into the endless blue void. Then she shook her head, gritted her teeth, and went back to work. Training had told her what to do, but it had never prepared her for this. In the cockpit, the air was thick with tension and the smell of ozone. The captain's hands never left the controls. His knuckles were white, his breathing shallow but steady. The co-pilot read out instrument readings in a voice that trembled between fear and focus. "Hydraulic pressure's unstable. Left stabilizer response is lagging, but we're holding altitude." The captain nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "We keep her steady, we bring them home." Every second was a negotiation with physics, every small movement a balance between too much and too little. One wrong correction, and the damaged airframe could tear itself apart. The engineer behind them monitored gauges that danced like restless fireflies, his pencil tapping rhythmically against the clipboard to keep his nerves from showing. "Fuel's good. Engines steady," he said quietly, though he knew the engines were shaking harder than they should. On the ground, air traffic control had gone silent except for the voice of one controller, calm and unwavering despite the sweat running down his neck. "Flight 981, you are clear for priority approach. Weather is stable. Runway personnel are on standby." His words echoed across the static, reaching into the cockpit like a lifeline. The captain keyed his microphone, forcing steadiness into his voice. "Roger that, Control. We'll need medical teams ready. Multiple injuries on board." As he released the button, his hand lingered over it, as if reluctant to let go of the connection to solid Earth. Then he whispered to no one in particular, "We're not losing anyone else today." Down in the cabin, the sense of unity had grown stronger, born from terror. A woman who had fainted earlier awoke to find her seatmate, a stranger, holding her hand. Across the aisle, a young man gave up his oxygen mask to an older passenger who was struggling to breathe. Two attendants used what little first aid supplies they had to stop bleeding from a passenger's arm, tying a scarf tightly to stem the flow. Despite everything, people were helping each other, strangers becoming family under the weight of survival. The fear was still there, it was everywhere, but so was something stronger, something that pushed back against it: courage. The aircraft shuddered suddenly, a deep metallic groan reverberating through the fuselage. Gasps filled the cabin as overhead compartments rattled. In the cockpit, the engineer's head snapped toward the gauges. "Pressure spike in the right wing tank." The captain cursed under his breath, adjusting the trim manually. "She's bleeding fuel. Keep an eye on it." The co-pilot scanned the horizon, his fingers twitching nervously. "We can still make it if we hold this rate of descent." The captain didn't reply. He was listening, to the aircraft itself, to the vibrations through the controls, to the whisper of air along the wings. He had flown long enough to know when a plane was talking back, and this one was telling him she was tired. He reached for the intercom, pressing the button with a steady hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've stabilized the aircraft, and we're on our way to make an emergency landing. The crew will guide you through preparations shortly. You've all done incredibly well. Stay calm, keep your belts fastened, and listen for instructions." His voice, calm and firm, rolled through the cabin like a promise. Passengers clung to those words as if they were a lifeline. The attendants exchanged glances, nodding in relief. The captain's tone alone told them something no technical readout could: they still had a fighting chance. But hope was fragile. Behind the captain's steady words was a storm of quiet calculations. The plane's structure had been compromised. The explosive decompression had weakened the floor beams, and if they descended too sharply or landed too hard, the fuselage could buckle. The engineers had warned of such possibilities long ago, but no manual could account for this kind of damage. The captain knew every choice he made from now on would decide hundreds of lives. He looked briefly at the photo taped beside his instruments, a faded picture of his wife and son, and exhaled. "Hold together," he whispered to the aircraft. "Just a little longer." As the DC-10 continued its slow descent, the world below began to take shape again. The deep blue of the ocean gave way to a smudge of coastline, sunlight glinting off the water. It was distant, but it was there, a reminder that land still existed, that salvation had a shape and color. The co-pilot pointed. "There. That's the island. That's our runway." The captain nodded, eyes narrowing. "We'll make it." But even as he said it, the controls stiffened again, resisting his pull. The aircraft groaned like a wounded beast, its airframe flexing under pressure. Alarms flickered briefly and died. They had no margin left for error. In the cabin, a soft voice began to sing. It was faint at first, a lullaby barely audible over the hum of the engines. A mother held her little boy close, singing to calm him, her voice trembling with both fear and love. Slowly, others around her grew quiet, listening. In that fragile melody, there was something almost sacred, something that spoke louder than panic ever could. Even the flight attendants paused for a heartbeat, tears welling in their eyes as they continued their duties. Amid disaster, life still persisted in its gentlest form. The control tower called again. "Flight 981, wind calm. Visibility clear. You're cleared for immediate approach." The captain replied, his voice steady. "Copy, control. Beginning descent. Tell them to stand by for a hard landing." He shut off the radio and looked at his crew. "This is it." The co-pilot nodded grimly. "She's held this long. She'll hold a little longer." Together, they began to lower the flaps, the metal protesting with a shriek. The airframe trembled, the cabin lights flickered, but the aircraft obeyed. The runway, still miles away, seemed to stretch toward them like a promise they weren't sure they could keep. For the passengers, time slowed. Every vibration through the deck, every flicker of the lights, felt amplified. Some whispered final prayers, others closed their eyes, too tired to think anymore. The attendants shouted over the intercom, "Brace position! Heads down, hands on your heads!" The words cut through the air like a heartbeat, steady, unyielding. The mother who had been singing held her child tighter, whispering, "It's okay, baby. We're going home." As the DC-10 tilted into final descent, the engines roaring in defiance, the passengers of Flight 981 braced themselves against fate. Outside, sunlight glimmered on the sea, and the coastline grew closer with every passing second. In the cockpit, the captain's fingers tightened on the controls, the co-pilot counting down altitude under his breath. The plane shuddered violently, its wounded frame threatening to give out. But even then, the crew refused to surrender. "Easy," the captain murmured. "Easy, hold her steady." The co-pilot swallowed hard, watching the runway emerge from the horizon. Almost there. The captain's eyes locked forward, his voice quiet but fierce. "We're not dying up here." And with that, the battered DC-10 flew on through the final stretch of sky, the engines straining, the cabin silent except for the wind, as 200 hearts waited for the ground to rise and prove that miracles still existed above the clouds. The island runway shimmered in the distance like a mirage, a thin gray line cutting across the deep blue of the ocean. The passengers of the DC-10 could see it now through the windows, a promise of safety glinting in the sunlight, but for the pilots, that sight only deepened the weight pressing against their chests. Every mile closer meant more stress on the wounded aircraft, every second an argument between gravity and human will. The captain's eyes didn't leave the horizon. Sweat rolled down his neck, pooling at the collar of his shirt, but his hands were steady. His knuckles were pale against the yoke. The co-pilot's voice was quiet, focused. Speed stable. Gears unlocked. Flaps responding, barely. The captain nodded once. "She'll hold," he murmured, as if trying to convince the plane itself. They both knew that the next few minutes would decide everything. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted from chaos to a tense, waiting silence. The roar of decompression had long faded, replaced by the low, unending groan of engines pushed to their limit. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, sweat, and fuel, and the only sounds were the hum of machinery and the quiet murmurs of passengers whispering prayers into their trembling hands. The flight attendants moved carefully through the aisles, their movements methodical and controlled, their faces hiding fear behind the calm of training. One checked the seat belts row by row, her fingers brushing over clasped hands and shaking shoulders. Another crouched beside an old man in the middle row whose hands wouldn't stop trembling. "We're almost home," she said softly. "You're going to be all right." Her words trembled slightly, but she forced them into strength. Hope was all they had left to give. The aircraft began its slow descent, the angle gentle at first, then steeper as they neared land. The wings flexed under the shifting air currents, the fuselage groaning like a wounded animal in pain. The captain adjusted the trim, listening to the aircraft as if it were speaking directly to him. The left stabilizer was failing, making the controls sluggish, unbalanced. "Keep the nose up," he ordered. "Flaps to 20. Watch the speed." The co-pilot moved swiftly, but the panel responded sluggishly. Lights flickered, and for a moment, all three engines coughed, shuddered, then steadied again. The captain's jaw tightened. "Come on, hold together," he whispered. He could feel the tremor in the control column, the faint, terrifying vibration that meant the airframe was near its breaking point. Every second now felt longer than a lifetime. Back in the cabin, the passengers were bracing. Mothers pressed children close. Strangers held hands. Some prayed out loud, their voices blending into a low murmur that rolled through the cabin like the sound of distant thunder. The crew began shouting instructions over the intercom, their voices trembling but strong. "Brace. Heads down, stay in position." The words echoed over and over, becoming rhythm, becoming ritual. Seat backs clicked, belts tightened, oxygen masks hung limply as passengers prepared for impact. One woman kissed a silver locket around her neck. Another scribbled a note onto the corner of a boarding pass, tucking it into her pocket. People do strange things when death feels near. They reach for anything that reminds them they once felt safe. In the cockpit, the control tower's voice crackled over the radio. "Flight 981, winds calm, you are cleared to land. Emergency crews are ready." The captain replied, voice steady and low. "Roger that, control. We'll be coming in heavy. Tell them to stand by." He cut the transmission and exhaled. "All right," he said to his crew, "this is going to be rough. No second chances." The co-pilot swallowed hard and nodded. "We'll make it." The captain's hand tightened on the throttle. Flaps to full. The engines roared in response, straining against the drag as the plane descended toward the strip of concrete ahead. Through the windshield, they could see fire trucks and ambulances lined along the runway edges, their lights flashing red and white against the haze. The final approach was agony. The aircraft trembled violently, the frame rattling like bones under pressure. Every vibration echoed through the cockpit and into the cabin. The landing gear groaned, the tires straining against the air resistance. At 200 feet, the plane dropped sharply and the co-pilot shouted, "Pull up! Pull up!" The captain responded instantly, yanking the controls back. The aircraft's nose lifted, the engines screamed, and for a moment, it seemed they might overshoot the runway entirely. Then the ground rushed up to meet them. The impact was brutal. Metal screamed against asphalt. The tires burst instantly, sending black smoke trailing behind. The force of landing threw passengers forward, seat belts cutting into ribs, heads snapping downward. Luggage compartments popped open, showering the aisles with debris. The tail section groaned under the stress, threatening to shear away entirely. The captain slammed the throttles to reverse thrust, shouting over the roar, "Brakes! Full brakes!" The co-pilot obeyed, his arms shaking from the effort. The runway blurred past the windows in a storm of fire and sparks as the aircraft skidded sideways, the right wingtip scraping the ground and sending a plume of flame trailing behind. In the cabin, screams mixed with the metallic screech of the landing gear tearing apart. Overhead panels ripped free, exposing wires that sparked in the smoky air. A flight attendant yelled, "Brace! Stay down!" as she clung to the back of a seat, her knuckles bleeding from the strain. The plane lurched again, throwing everyone forward as the nose slammed into the tarmac. It slid, shuddered, and then, miraculously, began to slow. The runway lights streaked past slower, the screech of metal giving way to the low groan of momentum dying away. Finally, with one last thunderous jolt, the DC-10 came to a stop. Silence fell. For a long, surreal moment, no one moved. The air was heavy, filled with the acrid smell of smoke and burning rubber. Then came the sound, soft at first, then rising, a wave of sobs, gasps, and voices whispering disbelief. People looked around, realizing they were still alive. A child cried out for his mother, and when she answered, his sob turned into laughter. One by one, passengers began unclasping their seat belts, trembling as they did. The cabin lights flickered weakly, revealing faces streaked with tears, soot, and relief. The cockpit door opened, and the captain stepped into the aisle, his face pale but composed. "Everyone stay seated," he commanded, voice calm, almost gentle. "Rescue crews are on their way. Help is coming." He looked down the length of the cabin, taking in the chaos, the broken panels, the smoke, the frightened eyes, and he felt his throat tighten. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "You made it." His words broke something inside the silence, and people began to weep openly, the sound raw and human. Outside, emergency vehicles swarmed the aircraft. Firefighters sprayed foam across the wings, dousing the smoldering fuel. Paramedics rushed toward the exits as flight attendants threw open the doors and deployed the slide. The hiss of compressed air filled the cabin as the slides inflated, flapping against the warm wind. "Go! Go!" the crew shouted, helping passengers down one by one. Some stumbled, some crawled, others simply collapsed on the tarmac, kissing the ground beneath their hand. The fire trucks circled, spraying water across the fuselage as black smoke rose against the afternoon sky. For the captain, the last to leave, the moment felt dreamlike. He paused at the doorway, turning back to look at the cockpit one last time. The controls were charred, the glass cracked, the panels scorched. He reached out, placing his hand on the frame. "Thank you," he whispered, "not to the machine, but to something greater." Then he stepped out into the blinding sunlight, his boots hitting the runway with the weight of every life he had carried. As the rescue crews worked and sirens echoed, the island air grew still again. The wrecked DC-10 stood there in the heat, battered, broken, but somehow still whole, a monument to survival. And as the captain looked back one final time, he realized that they had not simply landed an aircraft, they had pulled hope back from the edge of the sky. The cost was written in scars, in fear, in tears, but against every law of chance they had lived. The sound of the wind moved through the wreckage like a sigh, as if the sky itself was exhaling, relieved that, for once, it had let them go. The chaos on the runway slowly gave way to a heavy, trembling silence, the kind that only follows near death. The battered DC-10 rested crookedly on the tarmac, smoke rising from its scarred metal skin, its engines ticking and cooling in the humid air. Firefighters moved like shadows through the haze, shouting over the hiss of foam and the crackle of dying flames. The acrid scent of burning fuel hung over everything, clinging to skin, clothes, even breath. Rescue crews swarmed the aircraft, cutting through twisted metal and shattered panels, calling out to one another, their voices echoing in the humid stillness. For the survivors, time seemed to stop there on the runway. Each one moved like they were underwater, stumbling, coughing, weeping, clinging to anyone who offered a hand. Some dropped to their knees and kissed the concrete. Others just stood and stared back at the wreck that had carried them to hell and somehow back again. The captain, his uniform streaked with soot, stood a few paces from the broken fuselage. His hand still shook, though he tried to hide it. Paramedics moved around him, tending to the wounded, shouting for stretchers and oxygen tanks. He barely heard them. His gaze remained locked on the aircraft's torn side, the gaping hole that had turned his flight into a nightmare. The co-pilot approached quietly, his face gray with exhaustion. He stopped beside his captain, eyes wide with disbelief. "We actually made it," he whispered. The captain didn't answer right away. He exhaled slowly, the weight of everything crashing down now that the fight was over. "We did," he said finally. "But she almost didn't." He looked back toward the wreck, his voice barely audible. "She kept us alive when she shouldn't have." Inside the cabin, rescue workers moved carefully through the smoke. The air was thick, hazy, filled with dust and ash. The seats were twisted, the floor buckled where the pressure had ripped through the frame. They found passengers still strapped in, trembling but alive. Others lay unconscious, victims of the impact or the cold. A flight attendant, her arm in a makeshift sling, guided rescuers toward the back where a few passengers had been trapped beneath debris. "This way!" she shouted, coughing hard as the fumes burned her throat. Together they lifted twisted metal away, freeing a young man with blood streaking his face. His first words, hoarse and disbelieving, were, "Are we still in the air?" The attendant smiled faintly through tears. "No, honey," she said softly. "We're home now." Outside, ambulances lined the edge of the runway, their lights flashing red against the white glare of the afternoon sun. Survivors were loaded onto stretchers, some wincing in pain, others gripping the hands of strangers who had become family in those last terrible minutes. One elderly man, face streaked with soot, stopped a paramedic before being wheeled away. "The pilots," he rasped. "Don't forget them. They saved us all." The medic nodded, his own voice shaking. "They're safe, sir. They're alive." The man closed his eyes and let himself cry, not from pain, but from relief so deep it felt like release. Back near the terminal, journalists and airport staff were already gathering. News of the explosion and emergency landing had spread across the airwaves within minutes, and now the world wanted answers. Cameras pointed at the smoking wreck, capturing images that would soon circle the globe, pictures of fire, survival, and the haunting face of a machine that had nearly been torn apart mid-flight. The airline officials arrived quickly, their suits immaculate against the backdrop of ruin. They spoke in clipped tones to investigators, their faces tight, their eyes darting toward the survivors who sat wrapped in blankets. Behind them, investigators from the Aviation Authority began their work, photographing the wreckage, marking debris, collecting fragments of metal torn from the fuselage. The captain was finally guided away from the plane by a medic, though he resisted at first. "I need to be here when they finish," he protested, voice raw. "You need to be checked," the medic replied firmly. "You're bleeding." Only then did the captain glance down and notice the thin red streak running down his wrist from a shard of glass he hadn't even felt. He allowed himself to be led toward the ambulance but paused halfway, looking back one last time at the DC-10. It sat motionless under the sun, its paint scorched, its body dented, its tail marked by streaks of black soot, but it was still whole. It had refused to die, just as they had. Hours passed before the runway was cleared. Investigators worked methodically, piece by piece, as the heat shimmered off the tarmac. They crawled under the fuselage, measuring the size of the rupture where the cargo door had failed. One of them, an older engineer with years of experience, knelt beside the torn metal and shook his head slowly. "It's the door mechanism," he murmured. "It failed under pressure again." Another investigator crouched beside him, notebook in hand. "Same as before?" The older man sighed. "Same design flaw. The latch didn't seal properly." Once it blew, the cabin floor collapsed. It was luck. The structure held just enough to keep the fuselage from snapping. His words were heavy with the quiet grief of understanding how close they had come to total destruction. Meanwhile, at the nearby hospital, the survivors filled every hallway. Doctors and nurses moved urgently from room to room, tending to burns, fractures, and shock. Some passengers lay in beds staring blankly at the ceiling, their minds replaying the explosion over and over. One woman told a nurse, "I keep hearing it. That sound, it never stops." Another sat clutching her child, refusing to let go, whispering, "You're safe now. We're safe now," like a mantra that might make it real. Reporters gathered outside, but none were allowed in yet. The authorities wanted answers before the world could speculate. Late that night, the captain sat alone in a small hospital room, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence. His hands were bandaged, his uniform still faintly smelling of smoke. On the table beside him lay a cup of cold coffee and a folded note, scribbled words from one of his passengers, delivered by a nurse. "Thank you for not giving up on us." He stared at it for a long time, his throat tightening. The co-pilot entered quietly, leaning against the doorway. "They're calling us heroes," he said softly. The captain shook his head. "We're just lucky." "Maybe," the co-pilot replied, walking in and sitting down beside him. "But luck doesn't hold a plane together. You did that." The captain looked away, his voice barely a whisper. "No. We did." By morning, investigators released their preliminary findings. The explosion had begun when the cargo door latch failed mid-flight, blowing outward and tearing a section of the cabin floor away. The decompression that followed had been catastrophic, but the pilot's quick descent to a safe altitude and steady control had prevented the entire structure from collapsing. The aircraft had landed with hydraulic systems barely functioning, its left stabilizer nearly torn free. One investigator summed it up simply: it was a miracle in motion. News outlets around the world carried the story. Headlines read, "Crew saves hundreds in mid-air explosion," and "Miracle landing. DC-10 survives impossible odds." Footage of the landing, captured by a nearby resident, played on repeat, showing the wounded plane dragging sparks across the runway before coming to a halt. People watched with awe, unaware that behind the calm voices of those pilots had been a storm of fear, pain, and relentless determination. 4 weeks afterward, the survivors sent letters, flowers, and thanks to the crew. Families who had thought they'd never see one another again reunited in tears. One father, interviewed on television, said, "I saw the hole in the side of the plane. I thought that was the end. But somehow we touched down. Somehow they brought us back." The captain never appeared on camera. He turned down interviews, preferring silence. To him, the true story didn't need cameras or fame. It was already etched into the hearts of those who lived it. And though the world moved on, those who had been there never forgot. The smell of jet fuel could make their hands tremble, the sound of a pressurized door sealing could bring back flashes of cold air and screaming wind. But beneath the trauma, something powerful remained, a quiet gratitude, an unshakable respect for the strength of the human spirit. The DC-10 had been torn open, its heart nearly ripped out, but it still flew long enough to save them. And that, more than anything, became its legacy. When the captain finally returned to the runway weeks later, the wreckage had been cleared, leaving only scorched lines on the concrete. He stood there alone for a long time, listening to the hum of distant engines, the sound of other planes taking off into the same endless sky. The fear was still there, the memory of helplessness still burned deep, but so was pride, quiet and solemn. He looked up at the horizon and whispered to himself, "We were supposed to fall. But we didn't." The words vanished into the wind, but the sky seemed to listen, vast and eternal, holding within it the ghosts of that terrible day and the fragile miracle that had defied them. Morning broke over the airfield like a sigh of relief, the first rays of light washing over the blackened streaks still marking the runway where the DC-10 had skidded to a stop hours before. The fire trucks were gone now, the flashing lights replaced by a solemn quiet that hung over the tarmac like mist. Only the twisted metal and the scattered debris bore witness to what had happened the day before. Investigators moved like ghosts among the wreckage, their white coveralls stark against the dark streaks of soot. Cameras clicked softly. Notes were taken in murmured tones. The smell of jet fuel still lingered, sharp, heavy, unforgettable. The world outside was already calling it a miracle. But for those who had lived it, miracle didn't feel like the right word. It felt too clean, too simple. What had happened in that sky had been raw, violent, and human. It had been the result of instinct, courage, and will, the fragile thread that holds life together when everything else is falling apart. The captain arrived back on the airfield before sunrise, wearing the same uniform, still smelling faintly of smoke and adrenaline. He walked in silence, past the emergency vehicles, past the reporters waiting behind fences, their cameras aimed like weapons. No one stopped him. He simply kept walking until he stood before what was left of the DC-10. The fuselage sat there quiet, its skin torn and blackened, its wings drooping slightly as if bowed in exhaustion. The front nose had caved in from the impact, and the cargo bay door, the one that had triggered it all, lay on the ground several feet away, twisted into an unrecognizable shape. The captain stood there for a long time, saying nothing, his breath visible in the cool morning air. Then he raised his hand and touched the side of the plane, his fingers brushing the burnt metal. "You did good," he whispered softly. It wasn't for anyone else to hear, but the words carried a weight only he could feel. Hours later, investigators surrounded the cargo door, studying the mechanism in grim silence. "It's the latch," one said quietly, kneeling beside the remains. "She failed exactly where we feared she might." Another nodded, flipping through technical diagrams. "It's the same flaw that was reported years ago. It should have been fixed fleet-wide." The realization sank in like a stone. This disaster could have been prevented. It wasn't fate or bad luck. It was negligence, the kind that hides behind paperwork and time until it explodes into tragedy. When the captain was brought over to give his testimony, his face was unreadable. "We lost the door at 30,000 feet, he said simply. "The decompression was instant. We didn't stand a chance to react before the floor tore open." One of the engineers nodded, jotting notes as the captain's voice grew quieter. "We were lucky the controls didn't sever completely. If they had, we wouldn't be standing here." He stopped, glancing back toward the fuselage. "But that plane held. She held just enough." By afternoon, the survivors began returning to the airport to reclaim their belongings, or what little remained. They arrived in buses, their faces pale, their movements slow, cautious, as if stepping onto sacred ground. Many couldn't bring themselves to look at the wreckage. Some broke down the moment they saw it, overwhelmed by memories too fresh to face. Others approached quietly, whispering thank yous into the wind. A young mother, clutching her small child against her shoulder, stopped near the wing and began to cry. She had sung to her boy during the descent, her voice trembling but unbroken, and now the sight of the scorched metal brought it all flooding back. "We lived," she whispered, tears spilling freely. "We actually lived." Nearby, an elderly couple held hands, staring at the charred remains in silence. They didn't need to speak. The fact that they were both standing there said everything. Inside the terminal, the airline executives faced the press. Cameras flashed like lightning as the spokesperson stepped to the podium, his voice solemn. "We can confirm that the crew of Flight 981 executed an emergency landing following an explosive decompression caused by the failure of a cargo door latch. Thanks to their professionalism and swift action, the majority of passengers survived. Our deepest condolences go out to those injured." The reporters shouted questions, one after another. Was this preventable? Wasn't the DC-10 already under scrutiny for door design issues? The spokesperson hesitated, eyes flicking briefly toward the investigators at the back of the room. "We are cooperating fully with authorities," he said finally. But the truth was already out there, rippling through headlines and whispers across the world. The failure had been known. The danger had been documented. The warning had been ignored. As night fell, the captain sat alone on the hotel balcony, overlooking the dark sea. The sounds of distant waves echoed faintly below, rhythmic and hollow, like the slow beating of a heart. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it again. The flash, the roar, the cabin tearing apart, the faces of his passengers frozen in terror. His co-pilot had called earlier, his voice quieter than usual. "They're saying it's a miracle, you know." The captain didn't answer. "They're wrong," he said finally. "It wasn't a miracle. It was people doing what they had to do." The line had gone silent for a moment before the co-pilot replied, "Yeah, but we still got them home. That counts for something." It did. It had to. Over the following weeks, the investigation's findings became public. The latch mechanism on the cargo door was found to be structurally flawed, a weak design that had caused a similar disaster years earlier. The warnings had gone unheeded. This flight, this crew, had been forced to pay the price for someone else's mistake. Changes came swiftly after that. New regulations were introduced. The entire DC-10 fleet was grounded until the problem could be corrected. The captain and his crew were commended for bravery and professionalism under impossible circumstances. Letters poured in from across the world. Some from survivors, others from complete strangers who had heard their story and wanted to say thank you. Each one spoke of courage, of faith, of the human will to survive. And yet, despite the praise, despite the recognition, the captain couldn't shake the memories. Every time he heard the sound of wind through a doorway or the hum of engines, his chest tightened. He took a leave from flying for several months, choosing instead to speak with trainees and share his experience. "You can't ever get comfortable up there," he told them. "The sky doesn't forgive complacency. You respect the machine. You listen to her. She'll tell you when something's wrong, even if it's only a whisper." The young pilots listened, some wide-eyed, others skeptical, but none left without understanding the weight behind his words. Years passed, and Flight 981 became a case study in aviation schools, a story of failure that led to reform, and of courage that turned tragedy into survival. The footage of that burnt aircraft landing against all odds continued to circulate, reminding every pilot and passenger alike that technology alone doesn't save lives. People do. The names of the crew were written into aviation history, though the captain never sought fame or credit. He often visited the memorial erected near the airport, an arch of metal made from the remnants of the DC-10's fuselage, polished and engraved with the names of those who hadn't made it home. He'd stand there quietly, hat in hand, feeling the sea breeze brush against his face, listening to the faint echo of engines overhead. "You deserved better," he would whisper. "But we did what we could." One evening, years after the crash, he found himself back in the cockpit of a simulator, teaching a new generation of pilots about crisis management. As the students sat behind him, watching the screens display a simulated decompression scenario, he said softly, "The instruments won't save you. The manual won't save you. What will save you is your calm, your voice, your faith in each other." The simulation alarm blared, and for a second, the sound pulled him back to that day, the flash, the smoke, the deafening wind, but he steadied himself, breathing deeply. "You don't fight the sky," he continued. "You ask it to let you through." And when the session ended and the lights came back on, he smiled faintly, the ghosts finally a little quieter. Because no matter how many years passed, no matter how many safe landings followed, he knew one truth would always remain. The sky could take everything from you, peace, safety, even hope, but if you faced it with courage, if you fought with everything you had, it sometimes gave something back. Life. He looked out the window of the training center that evening, the horizon glowing in orange and gold, and whispered to himself, "We came down broken, but we didn't fall apart." The setting sun reflected off the distant runway, and somewhere in the wind, faint and steady, it almost sounded like an aircraft passing overhead, a quiet reminder that even in tragedy, flight endures, and that those who dare to defy the sky never truly stop flying. Thank you for listening to this story of courage, failure, and the fragile miracle of survival at 30,000 feet. If you felt this story move something inside you, if it reminded you of how powerful and resilient the human spirit can be, I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to the channel for more true stories of bravery, aviation, and survival. Because in every flight, in every storm, there's a heartbeat of humanity, and it deserves to be heard.